So if you walk down like a really busy street in Chicago and you just grin at every stranger you pass, you're generally considered, friendly, approachable.
Right, maybe just having a really good day.
Exactly. But take that exact same behavior, drop yourself right into the middle of Tokyo, and if you walk around grinning at everyone there, you are suddenly viewed as highly intrusive or, socially unaware.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Potentially even very disturbed.
Right. And that's what's so wild to me. Geography, it turns out, has the power to completely change how your mental state is evaluated.
It's a really profound realization, honestly.
Right.
Because, we tend to think of a medical diagnosis as something universal.
Yeah, like a broken arm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You fracture a bone, the X-ray shows that jagged line, whether you're in Chicago, Tokyo, or anywhere else on the planet. The physical reality of the body is largely independent of culture.
Right.
But when we step into the realm of the human mind, that clarity just evaporates. We're navigating this landscape where the definitions of health and illness are heavily influenced by the actual ground you're standing on.
Which is exactly why we're taking a slightly different approach for today's deep dive. I'm actually officially stepping into the role of the curious student today.
I love it.
Yeah, I want to ask the foundational and honestly sometimes uncomfortable questions about how we define mental health. And you are taking on the role of the lecturer, guiding me and you, our listener, through some incredibly thorny concepts.
Well, I will gladly accept the lecturer mantle. We have a lot of complex terrain to cover today, so my goal is to really synthesize the mechanisms behind these diagnoses.
So we can understand not just what the experts decide, but why they decide it.
Exactly.
Okay, so our foundational text for this exploration is section 15.1 of chapter 15 from Psychology 2E. And the mission today sounds deceptively simple. What exactly constitutes a psychological disorder?
It sounds simple.
Yeah, but before we even get into all the nuances of that, let's define a term that comes up constantly in this field. As the lecturer, how do you define psychopathology?
So psychopathology is essentially the study of psychological disorders.
Yeah.
It encompasses their causes, their progression, and, their symptoms.
Okay.
But, and this is key, it's also used to refer to the actual manifestation of a psychological disorder itself.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, when professionals look for psychopathology, they're trying to identify a pattern of inner experience and behavior that clearly indicates a mental illness.
Rather than just the messy, complicated reality of a normal human life.
Precisely. And finding that dividing line is the ultimate challenge.
Yeah, at the extreme ends of the spectrum, the distinction seems pretty obvious. Section 15.1 points out that if someone washes their hands 40 times a day to the point where they're literally bleeding, society readily recognizes that as a disturbance.
Right. Or if someone is hearing voices that no one else hears.
Yeah, exactly. But consider the experiences you, our listener, might have. What about a first-year college student feeling such intense homesickness that she can barely, get out of bed?
Or someone who experiences paralyzing nervousness every time they try to speak to a person they find attractive.
Right. Where is the line there?
Those middle ground scenarios, that's where the stakes are incredibly high. Because the way we draw this line dictates how society treats people.
It affects everything, right? Relationships, school, jobs.
Exactly. When we fail to clearly define a disorder, mental health struggles are so often dismissed as just character flaws.
Oh, yeah. Just cheer up.
Right. People are told to just try harder or use positive thinking, which is something you would literally never suggest to someone with a fractured radius.
That is such a good point. So let's start trying to draw that line. My initial instinct, putting on my student hat, is to look at statistics.
Okay, lay it on me.
If most people behave one way and someone behaves in a vastly different way, isn't a disorder just, a highly atypical behavior?
That statistical deviation is a very common starting assumption. And it's true that disorders do involve atypical feelings and behaviors.
Give me an example.
Well, imagine asking a classmate out on a date and being rejected. Feeling sad or disappointed is totally typical. It's the statistical norm.
Right. Everyone hates being rejected.
Yeah. But if that single rejection triggers an extreme depressive state where the person completely stops eating, they can't sleep for days, and they feel this profound, overwhelming sense of worthlessness, that reaction is highly atypical.
It deviates dramatically from the baseline.
Exactly, and it certainly points toward a potential disorder.
But the textbook completely dismantles the idea that atypical automatically means disorder, and it uses a brilliant counterexample, red hair.
Yes, the red hair anomaly. illustrates the flaw in that logic so perfectly.
Right, because right now, only about 4% of the population in the United States has red hair. Statistically speaking, it is highly atypical.
It is an anomaly.
But we obviously do not classify having red hair as a psychopathology. It's just a rare physical trait. And what makes this even more fascinating is the geographical shift.
The Scotland example.
Yeah, if you move to Scotland, about 13% of the population has red hair. So suddenly, your statistical anomaly is like significantly more typical.
Which forces us to move beyond mere statistics and confront the concept of cultural expectations. Because when rarity fails as a diagnostic tool, the argument usually shifts to social norms.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
The premise is that a disorder is a behavior that aggressively violates the accepted values of a culture. Consider someone standing on a crowded subway platform in the middle of a sweltering July afternoon,
Okay.
and they're wearing a heavy winter parka and screaming obscenity as the people walking by.
Yeah, I mean, anyone on that platform would immediately back away and assume the person is experiencing a severe psychiatric episode.
Right, because that behavior shatters our socially accepted rules for appropriate dress and public conduct. But relying on social rules is a dangerous diagnostic trap.
Because they change.
Because social rules are not objective laws of physics. They are entirely subjective agreements that change dramatically from one culture to another.
Which brings us back to that smiling example we opened with. The underlying mechanism there is so fascinating. In the US, reciprocating a smile from a stranger is like this ingrained social reflex.
It signals safety, friendliness.
Yeah, if you stare blankly at someone who smiled at you, you're perceived as hostile or, socially deficient.
But the mechanism in Japan, however, prioritizes a completely different social value, the boundary of privacy.
Right.
Japanese cultural norms dictate a really high degree of reserve and restraint around strangers. Uninvited engagement, like grinning at someone you do not know, forces an unwanted social interaction.
It breaks that privacy boundary.
Precisely. So the exact same muscular movement of the face is a sign of healthy socialization in Chicago and a sign of deeply problematic boundary-violating behavior in Tokyo.
That's wild. And Section 15.1 highlights how eye contact follows a similar pattern, right?
It really does.
In Western Europe and the US, maintaining eye contact shows honesty and active listening. But in many Latin American, Asian, and African cultures, looking directly into the eyes of someone, especially like an elder or an authority figure, is interpreted as confrontational or even aggressive.
The behavior itself doesn't change, but the cultural filter turns an honest person into an aggressive threat.
Exactly.
And this cultural filtering extends to internal experiences as well, like hallucinations.
Oh, this part was fascinating.
Experiencing visual or auditory sensations that have no physical source is treated as a profound red flag violation of reality in Western societies. It's a hallmark symptom of severe psychopathology, like schizophrenia.
Right. If you hear voices, you go to a doctor.
But anthropological studies show that in some indigenous cultures, experiencing visions, particularly those involving ancestors or future events, is regarded as a spiritually significant, incredibly positive experience.
So they aren't diagnosed with an illness at all.
No, they are elevated as a spiritual conduit.
And it's not just geography. Time alters these norms just as radically. Think about the cultural expectations of fashion.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine someone confidently walking onto a modern corporate campus today wearing like peak 1980s attire, leg warmers, neon spandex, heavily hairsprayed big hair.
They would certainly get some stares.
It violently violates today's aesthetic norms. But 40 years ago, it was the literal definition of fitting in.
Which brings us to a really critical philosophical precipice.
Yeah, because if diagnostic criteria are at the mercy of whether you are in Chicago or Tokyo, or whether it's 1985 or today, we're left with a fairly cynical conclusion.
Go on.
It makes me wonder if mental illness is even an objective reality. Like, is it possible that society simply invented the concept of psychopathology to slap a medical label on people who refuse to conform?
Well, you are echoing one of the most polarizing debates in the history of psychiatry.
Really?
Oh, yeah. In the 1950s and 60s, a psychiatrist named Dr. Thomas Szasz built his entire career on that exact premise.
Wait, a psychiatrist?
Yes. He famously declared that mental illness was a myth that justifies psychiatric intervention in socially disapproved behavior.
Wow. A psychiatrist calling his own field's primary focus a myth is a massive indictment.
It was revolutionary and deeply, deeply disruptive. To understand Szasz, you have to understand the strict medical model he adhered to.
Okay, break that down for me.
He argued that the definition of a true disease requires a detectable abnormality in bodily structures. To call something an illness, a doctor must be able to point to a bacterial infection, cellular damage, or, a visible lesion.
Something on a test.
Exactly. And because the vast majority of purported mental illnesses lacked these detectable physical markers, Szasz concluded they could not be classified as diseases.
But if he didn't view them as medical diseases, what did he call them? How did he categorize the profound struggles people were clearly experiencing?
He termed them problems in living. Szasz believed that humans naturally struggle with existentially difficult circumstances, relationship friction, and societal pressures. But he argued that the mental health establishment essentially colluded with society to invent the disease label.
So by medicalizing nonconformity, society could easily isolate people who violated norms without, examining its own systemic flaws.
That was his argument, yes.
Okay, while I appreciate the skepticism regarding societal control, calling severe psychological distress a mere problem in living feels incredibly dismissive to me.
A very common reaction to his work.
Because when we look at someone paralyzed by panic attacks or suffering from the sheer internal anguish of profound depression, that distress is visceral. People lose their careers, their families, and sometimes their lives.
Right.
Denying the reality of that suffering by calling it a myth just seems dangerous.
And the modern psychiatric community entirely shares your objection. Today, the field universally validates the extreme, debilitating reality of the suffering caused by psychological disorders.
Good. Because the cognitive distortions, the emotional pain, the severe functional impairment, you just can't dismiss that as a myth.
You can't. However, and this is where Szasz's legacy becomes deeply compelling, his controversial views created this incredible historical paradox.
How so?
By being fundamentally wrong about mental illness being a myth, he accidentally provided the exact philosophical framework needed to advance human rights.
Wait, how does calling a disease a myth end up advancing human rights?
By forcing the medical establishment to relentlessly examine its own biases. First, it shifted the vernacular. Many professionals now refer to mental health problems, rather than always defaulting to diseases, which subtly humanizes the patient's experience.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the most profound impact occurred in 1965. Szasz was one of the first prominent psychiatrists to publicly challenge the classification of same-sex attraction as a mental illness.
Oh, wow. That is a staggering historical detail.
During an era when the psychiatric establishment widely viewed homosexuality as a pathology requiring intervention, Szasz utilized his framework to argue that it was simply a deviation from a cultural norm, lacking any biological defect.
And his vocal opposition laid crucial groundwork for the gay and lesbian civil rights movements.
Exactly. Furthermore, his deep suspicion of psychiatric authority inspired sweeping legal reforms. His work directly contributed to legislation that protected the rights of patients involuntarily committed to psychiatric institutions.
Ensuring they retained a degree of autonomy.
Right.
That is an incredible historical paradox. His overarching theory was flawed regarding the reality of the suffering, but his insistence on questioning cultural biases genuinely changed the world for the better.
It really did.
Still, we are left with a diagnostic void here. If Szasz goes too far by saying it's all a social construct, and the cultural norm approach is too flimsy because society constantly changes its mind, we are stuck.
We need a better framework.
Yeah, we need a way to ground a diagnosis in something objective.
And this necessity is exactly what gave rise to a highly influential framework proposed by Jerome Wakefield in 1992. Wakefield attempted to bridge the gap between objective biology and subjective cultural experience.
What did he call it?
He called his concept harmful dysfunction.
Harmful dysfunction. Let's unpack the mechanics of that phrase. If we start with dysfunction, it implies that a specific machine or process has, well, broken down.
Precisely. Wakefield grounded the concept of dysfunction in evolutionary biology. Human beings possess internal mechanisms, psychological and cognitive processes that were honed over thousands of years of evolution to keep us alive and functioning.
Like what kind of mechanisms?
We have mechanisms for perception, for emotional regulation, for learning. Consider the mechanism of fear conditioning.
Okay.
We are evolutionarily wired to learn to associate fear with venomous creatures or dangerous heights. The mechanism's job is to trigger a fear response that matches the actual level of danger.
Right, it keeps us from getting eaten.
Exactly. A dysfunction occurs when that internal, evolved mechanism breaks down and fails to perform its normal function.
So the internal wiring misfires.
Yes.
But a broken mechanism alone isn't enough to constitute a psychopathology. I mean, we
Yeah.
all have cognitive quirks or irrational fears or mechanisms that don't operate with perfect efficiency.
Which is why the second half of the framework is mandatory. It must be harmful. The dysfunction only crosses the line into a disorder when it leads to significant negative consequences.
And this is where Wakefield integrates culture,
You
right?
got it. The harm, whether it's severe internal anguish or the inability to manage day-to-day living, is ultimately judged by the standards of the individual's culture.
Let's map this onto a real-world scenario to make sure the mechanics are clear.
Sure.
The textbook uses the example of someone with an intense, overwhelming fear of spiders.
A classic example.
So the evolutionary mechanism learning to avoid potentially venomous insects is entirely natural. But in this person's case, the mechanism is severely malfunctioning. They're associating a massive paralyzing level of fear with an insect that poses almost zero actual threat to their survival. The calibration is broken. That is the dysfunction.
Correct. The internal fear processing mechanism has failed. Now, how do we determine the harm?
Well, the harm is measured by the destruction of their daily life. If they simply dislike spiders and ask someone else to catch them, there's no real harm.
Right, that's just a preference.
But if this person completely avoids going into basements, stops visiting friends' homes because a spider might be there, and eventually quits a necessary job because they saw a spider in the office restroom,
Right.
the harm is catastrophic.
They are unemployed and socially isolated.
Exactly. That combination is the essence of harmful dysfunction. The objective biological mechanism has failed and has resulted in culturally recognized, highly subjective harm.
And the brilliance of Wakefield's model is that it builds a bridge between subjective behavioral observation and contemporary neurobiology.
So even if we can't always see the broken mechanism,
Exactly. Even if our current brain imaging technology isn't sensitive enough to spot every misfiring neural pathway, this model operates on the assumption that a physical, biological reality underpins the psychological symptom.
so if we are successfully bridging biological dysfunction and societal harm, I imagine this theoretical framework heavily influenced how modern clinicians actually operate.
Very much so.
When a patient walks into a clinic today, how do doctors measure these concepts to arrive at an official diagnosis?
Clinicians today rely on the formal criteria established by the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA. In 2013, the APA synthesized decades of debate and formalized a definition of a psychological disorder built on 4 distinct pillars.
Or pillars? Okay.
And you will clearly see the DNA of Wakefield's model in these criteria.
If the APA is heavily influenced by the concept of a broken mechanism disrupting a life, I would assume their starting point, the first pillar, has to focus on the actual thoughts and behaviors themselves, the things causing the chaos.
That is exactly right. The first pillar mandates that there must be significant disturbances in thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Meaning?
The patient must experience inner states or exhibit behaviors that are highly unusual, but specifically in a negative, self-defeating manner. Someone who is uncontrollably preoccupied with thoughts of contamination and spends 6 hours a day scrubbing their hands is exhibiting a significant negative disturbance.
Okay. And based on Wakefield's model, that disturbance can't just be a random personality quirk. There has to be a root cause. So the second pillar must address the internal breakdown.
Pillar 2 states that the disturbances must reflect a biological, psychological, or developmental dysfunction.
So the mechanism is broken.
The APA requires that the disturbing behaviors point back to a flaw in the internal biological or cognitive mechanisms. When a clinician observes the complex hallucinations present in schizophrenia, they understand those are not eccentric behaviors. They are manifestations of underlying brain abnormalities. The hardware or the software is genuinely malfunctioning.
But again, a malfunctioning mechanism isn't enough on its own. We need the harm component.
Which brings us to the third pillar. The disturbances must lead to significant distress or disability in one's life. Clinicians refer to this as functional impairment.
But how does a clinician objectively measure significant distress sitting across from someone in an office? Is it just like a self-reported feeling?
It's deeply tied to how the person functions in society. They look for tangible breakdowns. If someone experiences intense social anxiety, the clinician looks at the functional impairment.
Like what?
Is the distress so severe that the person has dropped out of college? Are they entirely unable to apply for jobs? Have they isolated themselves from all relationships?
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if a person feels nervous but still manages to attend class and maintain a job, the distress does not rise to the level of a clinical psychopathology.
So the functional impairment is the deciding factor. But exploring these three pillars, a disturbance in feelings caused by a psychological dysfunction, leading to immense distress and an inability to function it, raises a massive red flag for me.
Let's hear it.
What happens when a person experiences a genuinely catastrophic life event? Imagine the sudden death of a child or a spouse.
Okay.
A person in that situation will likely withdraw completely. They will experience overwhelming sadness, and they might be entirely unable to go to work or maintain their daily responsibilities for months.
That's very true.
Their emotional regulation is overwhelmed, and their functional impairment is absolute. Does the APA classify profound grief as a psychological disorder?
That specific scenario is precisely why the fourth pillar is absolutely crucial to the diagnostic process.
Okay.
The APA's fourth pillar explicitly states, the disturbances do not reflect expected or culturally approved responses to certain events.
So they build an exception into the rules for the human condition.
Exactly. When a clinician assesses a patient paralyzed by grief after the death of a loved one, they look to cultural expectations. Experiencing agonizing sadness, withdrawing from society, and being unable to function are perfectly natural, culturally anticipated responses to profound loss.
So the mechanism isn't actually broken.
Right. The internal mechanisms of attachment and loss are reacting exactly as they are meant to. Therefore, despite meeting the criteria for severe distress and impairment, the grief is recognized as a normal human experience, not a mental disorder.
Stepping out of my student role to look at the big picture here, the complexity of this process is truly remarkable.
It really is.
Defining psychopathology requires clinicians to balance on an incredibly thin wire. They can't just look for a broken bone. They have to weigh statistical atypicality, evolutionary biology, functional impairment, and deeply ingrained cultural norms, all while making sure they aren't pathologizing normal human suffering.
It is a delicate, constantly evolving balancing act, and it's important to acknowledge that there is no perfect mathematical formula. There is no single essential criterion that flawlessly separates every case of disorder from non-disorder. The boundary requires constant reassessment.
Which brings us to the most vital takeaway for you, our listener. The human mind is messy. Experiencing periods of intense anxiety, battling unwanted intrusive thoughts, or navigating periods of deep sadness does not mean your mechanisms are permanently broken.
Absolutely not.
Those experiences are often just the friction of the human condition. A diagnosis only enters the picture when those experiences become highly disturbing, when they stem from a genuine dysfunction, and when they severely fracture your ability to live your daily life.
Well said.
And when someone does cross that threshold, they deserve the exact same stigma-free medical care as someone dealing with a physical ailment.
Absolutely. The mind and the body are not separate entities. They require the exact same level of rigorous, compassionate treatment.
Before we close out this deep dive, there is one final provocative angle to consider. We explored how heavily the APA relies on cultural norms to decide what is an expected or acceptable response to the world.
Right, the fourth pillar.
So, if culture dictates the diagnosis, how might future generations look back at the way we classify disorders today?
That's an interesting thought.
Consider the relentless, high-stress, digitally saturated environment we live in right now. Is it possible that the anxiety and distress we currently diagnose as a dysfunction is actually a perfectly normal, healthy human reaction to an entirely unnatural modern environment?
Oh, wow.
It makes you wonder, maybe the internal mechanisms of the mind are working exactly as intended, and it is the world we have built around us that is deeply broken.